Hello, everybody. My name is Gaven Simon, and welcome back to the Sustainability Podcast. Today, I am joined by Ryan Elliott and Mirko Woitzik, and we're going to be discussing the 2025 Everstream Annual Risk Report. Ryan and Mirko, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you guys doing today?
Doing great, Gavin. Thanks.
Great. Thanks for having us.
How you doing?
Doing pretty well. It's Friday, I'm excited to sit down with you guys. And we spoke earlier about this, and this report really stood out to me. And my little background, I work mainly in sustainability, but recently have been diving into supply chain topics. So I'm really excited to dive into this report. Before we really get into the nitty gritty, do you guys want to both just give a little background about yourselves and how you came to Everstream and what Everstream is all about?
I'm Ryan Elliott. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Everstream. I joined last year. I joined from A.T. Kearney, which is a big consulting firm with a lot of focus on operations and supply chain. While there, I founded our services offering around supply chain risk management, where I had the opportunity to work with pretty much all of the supply chain risk management software companies, got to know Everstream really well, talked to the management team a lot about how I see the industry going and marrying artificial intelligence with human intelligence. They liked that idea and then asked me to join full-time late last year. So delighted to be here.
Amazing.
Hi, Kevin. I'm Mirko Woitzik. I'm directing our product for real-time risk monitoring, which is called Reveal at Everstream Analytics. I've been with the company 8 years. Actually started out within DHL. It was a small sort of supply chain risk management unit that basically then grew too big for DHL to handle, and then basically we founded Everstream and bought a few other companies, and basically Everstream was born 5 years ago. Yeah, I have quite a bit of background in logistics, and have been with the company for a while. So excited to be here to talk about some risks that we see trending for 2025.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. Really happy to hop into this. You sent over the report and it was really interesting to me, and I just kind of want to get a background. So how is this a report that you've done annually? Does it come out every year? And really, what is the background of this report, and what's the data being pumped into it? How's it built?
Yeah, I can take that one. So all of the data that you see in the report, or let's say 95% of the data that you see in the report, is all analysis based off of Everstream Analytics data or proprietary data that we sort of gather in terms of supply chain risk events, and then matching it with supply chains that we monitor for different clients in many different industries, food and beverage, automotive, medical devices, pharma, and really we're probably monitoring all of the important supply chain locations in the world, whether that's companies, suppliers, mines, farms, or on the logistics side, ports, airports, borders. And then we basically overlay that with our incident data. And whenever there's a match, we would sort of create an alert for our customers to sort of talk to them and sort of analyze that situation for them so that they are aware of what's going on in their supply chain. And most of them have global supply chains. So all of that data is really unique. It's a unique set of data. And we've started to produce this risk report, I think, 4 years ago. And it's now an annual report that we typically push out in early January to basically talk about the big risk trends. We do a look back section on how was 2024, what happened, and then basically we look at all of the data and try to understand what are the trends, in terms of different topics, different risks, and how that sort of trends in different industries, and basically make a prediction on what we see in terms of the trends and what are the strongest ones backed up by our data that will make it into the 2025 report. So it's, I think, a very exciting report because it's based off data, but there's also a lot of insights into client stories and what we've learned over the last 10 years as supply chain risk management has really evolved into its own market, its own sort of.
Mirko and Mirko's team, they do a lot of the detailed analysis. I think my contributions to the report is more around, well, how should companies react? Given these challenges, what actions can we actually take right now? So I think in a lot of this conversation, Mirko will speak directly to the report, and I'll kind of add on, well, here's what I'm kind of counseling customers with now.
Amazing. Well, thank you. So I guess I was quite surprised that this was the number one risk, but I was also unsurprised, and that was climate change. Climate change had a 90% risk rate. And so I guess I want to ask you, what are the areas that climate change is damaging the supply chain, and what are some of the mitigation strategies to reduce these impacts?
Yeah. So basically, I mean, there's really two, I want to say, big factors of to why climate change is so impactful for supply chain. One is obviously the devastating force by which it hits. And typically, it will not spare any structure, any building, any machine. And when we talk specifically about manufacturing or agricultural supply chains, and it's still about physical movement of goods most of the time. And so that devastating force, whether that's floods or rainfall or winds or fires, as we're seeing right now also in LA, it doesn't stop in front of any sort of building. And that's really, once it hits, there's really a huge impact in terms of the devastation that it creates and then the disruption that it causes. And then the second point is also the great variety, I think, of the general climate change risk is by how it impacts supply chain, right? It could be sort of rainfall, it could be rivers, floods, flash floods, but then it could also be just the sheer force of winds or tornadoes or hurricanes or tropical cyclones. And then you have obviously also snow and ice and freezing temperatures. It's really that great variety that we've also, I think, also seen in 2024 when you think about Hurricane Helene. That started with extreme winds that everybody sort of prepared for, which is also not unusual and uncommon for that time of the year. But then basically most of the devastation was created by the river floods, right? And all of the locations that were near the overflowing rivers. If you look into California, you have the wind and wildfire combination, right? And you look into Texas, you have snow and ice all of a sudden. Also a couple of years ago in 2021, these freezing temperatures that nobody really expected that time of the year for Texas. Or in Spain this year, you have a lot of flash floods where just the infrastructure is overwhelmed by the amount of rainfall within 24 hours. And basically, everything is, all the streets are over flooded. So it's really that variety that you have to prepare for in your different global locations that really makes for such a damaging impact to supply chain.
You're exactly right. I mean, every situation that you had mentioned, I had like flashes of like memories of like photos and videos that I've seen from each one of those events. I mean, I have family in Florida, and like the back-to-back hurricanes was devastating, and these people are just caught off guard. And I guess like in my background and like within sustainability, I'm always thinking about like residential communities and like families and just like regular individuals. But then when you overlay companies, and it's like, how do you strategically plan for the future of your company to be based in Tampa Bay, but then you had two back-to-back hurricanes like slam into this area? So these are very real concerns that these companies have to understand and plan for. And I don't think it's no longer a political ideology of a belief of climate change that's happening. And like we've seen, like, even in the past 3 weeks of the new year, we have a climate catastrophe hitting the west coast of the United States. And sadly, this is not going to be the last event within 2025. And my next question was like, how do you foresee these trends or of more frequent and disruptive weather events evolving in the coming years? And I guess I'll turn that question into, what do you think are some of the strategies that these companies are going to employ to kind of like protect themselves from these climate events?
Yeah, it's funny, Gavin, or maybe funny is not the best word to use, but it's going to happen in the long run. It's an inevitability, but where and when and to what extent is very, very difficult to predict. So I kind of look at this long-term, medium-term, short-term. In the long term, and one of the things that we've done to help our customers is we have climate scores, and we can actually do pretty far out planning with this. And this is really for your long-term supply chain planning to say, all right, well, if I'm located in this general region, here's how things have shaped up. Here's how we think things are going to continue. So that's our new climate score offering. In the very short term, that's when it can be tricky, because we usually have, within a few days, you start to say, okay, well, this hurricane could hit us, or it's very, very dry, very high risk of wildfires. So we have those predictors. I still think that most companies, or certainly many companies, are still scrambling when the actual event hits, because they're saying, well, wait, did we have any suppliers there? So it's one of our core functions that we help customers with. We call it the Reveal product, where we can map out your direct network and your direct supplier. So then when something's going to hit, or we can actually do scenario modeling, we think this is going to hit, we are in this shipping lane, we're in this location. And in the midterm, it's kind of, all right, we're putting this together. We know we've got some suppliers in this general area. Are we willing to accept that risk? What is the actual risk? It takes a lot of judgment, and every company has a risk appetite, right? And everyone has different alternatives. In some cases, it's, well, It's a really good supplier. I am worried that they're susceptible to, river flooding, but I really want to stick with them. So let me see if I can find a second source and me get something in place should something bad happen that I can act quickly. But then the most powerful thing is just awareness of where you have exposure so that you can, at the worst, react quickly, and at best, be proactive.
I have one additional question. I meant to ask this earlier. So with these climate scores, or let's say that there's like maybe strong winds or strong floods anticipated coming, is Everstream like themselves like emailing a customer that is under this like concern or risk, or is it like a notification that your software solution like notifies the customer? How is that like contact? How is that delivered?
So basically, there's two components to it, right? The climate risk score, which is more strategic, more forward-looking, right? Because you don't want to do firefighting, which is already happening, too much, I would say. But you also want to see like, where is my strategic risk, and where can I basically make a change ahead of time, right, before something happens. And so this strategic risk, you would also, if there's a change, let's say there's a higher risk for tornadoes or earthquakes or storms at this certain location, which is sort of also evolving over time. You would get a notification, and then you can sort of, take that into account in your strategic assessment. Where do I source from in the future? Do I want to switch a supplier? Do I want to diversify? Do I want to set a new warehouse or new, distribution plants somewhere else, which is maybe a little bit more safe? But then you also have the immediacy, sort of the immediate, what's going on right now. Is there a rainfall event? Is there a flooding event? Is there a tornado hitting right now? Which is more of the real-time disruption component, which is quite reactive. Customers can get the notification of that through multiple means. They can get it via email. They can get it via SMS. They can get it via into their API, into their own systems. Wow. So it's a very real-time driven component to it versus sort of the strategic risk scores, where you will find out also how it evolves over time. But it doesn't change day to day. Every 6 months there might be an update based on the latest events that are happening in real time.
And I'll add, weather is an area where I do think we're pretty distinguished. We have a meteorology group within our company, so actual meteorologist, which I think is fairly unusual. And with that, we can interpret what we see on the horizon in terms of weather for actual supply chain. So we see this happening. Here's the companies here. Here's what you should be concerned about. Here's what you should keep an eye on. And then that meteorology group, they also provide some of our customers who are subscribed weekly overviews. Here's what we think is happening in weather and events. And, it's basically anything. I say weather, but that's not really correct. It's really all these climate events in the next week, and what we're keeping our eye on, what you should be alert. And we just changed the frequency of those from once a week to twice a week, because it's happening so fast and furiously that twice a week update is necessary.
And maybe, Gavin, if I may add, so if you look at, because you had a question on how do we assess basically the frequency of these types of events, right? These disruptive weather and climate events, how they're evolving in the coming years. And if you look at the origin of this increasing trend, right, we see more and more over years. And we've said that in the report, it really lies, like the origin really lies in the global ocean temperatures, which have been rising for the past 40 to 50 years. And every year seems to set a new record in terms of higher ocean temperatures. In 2024, actually, we had the highest level in recent history. And by recent history, we mean 100 years. So they're at their highest point now. And basically, higher ocean temperatures mean higher evaporation rates, which sends overall more moisture into the atmosphere. And then you have more of that moisture, and the potential for these flood events, atmospheric rivers, tropical storms, thunderstorms, tornadoes that are happening, right? So, but it all goes back to the global ocean temperatures, which have been rising. And so the overall trend is really only into a direction of increase, right? And so we are expecting definitely more and more of these types of events, which is, I think also why supply chain risk management is such a important topic right now, because obviously the human impact, as we've seen, you talked about the hurricanes in Florida and North Carolina, but down the line it also impacts, the movement of goods, and in the end, everything that's, from farm to fork or to the shelf, and basically, to avoid stockouts, ensure medicine is, medicine supply is flowing. And there was actually that big example from Baxter, right? There was this IV fluid factory that was down in North Carolina and actually supplied over 60% of certain IV fluids domestically in the US. And that plant was basically close to a river which was overflowing, so there was a lot of damage, and you cannot make up 60% at short notice, right? So everybody was struggling, and even the US government was helping to build up that and speed up any new permits that they need to have in order to rebuild the plant or parts of it. So it really has a tangible impact on humans as well, right? The supply chain, because we all depend on medicines flowing, medical devices flowing, food flowing. So it's really important.
Yeah. I feel like there's so many concerns around the supply chain coming at so many different angles, and that's what this report really revealed to me. And the next one was very timely, and I feel like a lot of my work and focus on global trade compliance and all these different swirling regulations, and I always like to say that these companies are navigating a regulation maze between these conflicts abroad and the new US administration coming in. This past week there has been claims that there's going to be a 25% tariff on all imports from Canada, Mexico, and a possible 10% tariff on the European Union. Obviously, this is just news and headlines. I don't know which one of these are actually concrete. These are changing opinions and plans. But how does a company that see these headlines or this swirling concerns around these potential tariffs and difference in regulations, how do they prepare for these tit for tat policies and this uncertainty?
Yeah, I think this is it's a great question, and it's a question almost every one of our customers has asked me in the last month or so. There's a pretty strong sentiment just out there that, look, we don't know what's going to happen. Where are we serious? Where is it kind of a negotiation? And as you said, Gavin, it's very hard to say what tariffs will land where and when. In some ways, I actually coach folks, let's not try to figure out the likelihood of a certain tariff and a certain tariff percentage in a location, because that takes some kind of political information and that's not a game that's not information I can provide you. But what we can do right now is we can figure out where supply chain enters the US for you. At what supplier, at what level. It's not necessarily easy, but we've done a lot with this with customers with UFLPA, and we have plenty of experience figuring out where a supply enters your supply chain in the US and via which suppliers. So the way I look at it is, regardless of where the tariffs land, if you can be the first to react, you can have a major advantage over your competitors. And the reason I say that is because a lot of companies, if you say, I don't know what the tariffs are going to be, I'm just going to throw my hands up in the air. Let's wait and see where they are, and I'm going to react as quickly as possible, and I've got a Tiger team set up to attack it. And a lot of folks are doing that, and it's better than nothing, absolutely. But I do think the better strategy is if you can say, all right, well, I know that this key component, you have to prioritize. So let's prioritize what's most important. Where do I have multiple sources of supply? What's strategically important to my products? Whatever it may be. You prioritize that and say, okay, well, this component, we know we've got these handful of key suppliers. We know that a lot of this supply tends to come from international sources, like these particular minerals mostly come from this handful of countries. And if you kind of keep on pulling that thread and say, all right, well, it's coming from China, or coming from Vietnam via China through my tier 2 supplier. If you've got that visibility for the key ones, if it turns out that there's a tariff and that's going to impact the transaction wherever it comes into the States, then when you see the announcement, you can call your supplier and say, hey, look, we've done some mapping. We're not certain of these connections. We've done as much as we can in the time frame, but we have reason to believe that one of your suppliers is here. Is that true? Now, what are some alternatives? Can we work with you on that? And ideally, of course, you want to have the conversation before the tariff hits. You could say, do you have alternatives? Can we help you here? A lot of folks shy away from that conversation. It's not my supplier, privity of contract. But I think it's all how you frame it, right? If you frame it like, look, I don't have all the answers here, but we're doing this within our company. It's our supply chain. You're in our supply chain. You've got the same problem. Let's open up the lines of communication and figure out what we can do here. If you can help them find an alternative supplier, of course that helps you and that helps them. And then if you can be the first to adjust throughout your supply chain, wherever it hits, and you can get out of the tariffed country before your suppliers, then you'll secure that supply. It's a finite resource, right? And in supply chain risk management, one of the trickier things, I think, when talking to CPOs about why to invest in this function, this software, it can be a difficult ROI argument to make. It's kind of like insurance, right? If something bad happens, it's a great return. Nothing bad happens, the return is a little bit harder to define. I mean, you get some sort of peace of mind. With tariffs, I mean, there's a hard return. It's not necessarily easy to calculate, but if your supply is going to cost less, if you're getting it out of non-tariffed countries, then you've got a cost advantage, and that's a pretty tangible reason to do this all.
Thank you. That was really informative, and I think I totally agree with all those statements. And even just like beyond like the tariffs, there's like a similar sentiment even when it goes into climate. Like you have a supplier maybe in like Louisiana, and like that's a prone area for like hurricanes and stuff like that, and preparing for those incoming changes within your supply chain is important. And I love the piece of like that increases your competitive advantage against your competitors, and I think that's 100% on the money. Another thing that was really interesting in this report that honestly caught me off guard, but when I read it, I was like, oh, that actually makes complete sense, is the increasing like cybersecurity threats within your supply chain. But how those cybersecurity threats come into your email which was most surprising to me. Can you give a little insight of what these cybersecurity threats look like, and maybe why they're increasing, and like how to mitigate any of those impacts or any cybersecurity threats happening to you or your company?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's also a very recent phenomenon. Obviously, weather has always been there, and that's really how supply chain risk management started, right? Because of hurricane season, because of those once in a decade events, or sort of cyber events have been happening more on a supplier level, right? There sometimes do happen, maybe on a national level, state actors, if you think about Ukraine or other attacks that then spill over into companies' networks. Typically, these are targeted attacks against specific companies, and they could be your supplier, right? And they could be completely shut down. They could just have a sort of a breach, for sensitive data that there's no operational impact, but it could also be that the entire IT network is shut down, and basically you can do nothing in terms of communication, or production lines are down because everything has to be rebuilt. We've seen attacks that basically lasted for 2-3 weeks, which are then also global, right? Much more, that would be like having an earthquake in multiple locations at the same time, hitting the same company. I mean, the amount of damage it can do to your supply chain is phenomenal, right? Really, but also very recent, as you said. And what companies have been really focused on before was always, the security of your own organization, right? Let's make sure we educate our staff to sort of, be vigilant about, phishing attacks and social engineering attacks, etc. But it's also about making sure that, your suppliers are aware of it, that they have plans in place, that they're very cyber focused, because you might have API connections or other integrations, from a software perspective or hardware perspective that you can't control, right? So that's where really the supply chain angle comes into play. And most of the attacks that we see nowadays, and we've tracked over 1,200 last year alone, and that number has been increasing in the last 5 years. Most of these attacks are actually happening on a sub-tier level, right? Where criminals can maybe more easily exploit vulnerabilities and use that then to leapfrog into the networks of multinationals, right? Through other means. And we've seen also out of the 1,200 attacks, most of them are actually happening in the electronics industry, interestingly, because it's also very, very integrated, very global. And that has been followed by logistics and general manufacturing. Definitely an angled or a concern among many different supply chains about cyber. Some are more affected than others, but definitely everybody should take notice and really has to try to adjust to it. One interesting example I wanted to give was about the CrowdStrike cyber attack that happened in July last year, because that was very interesting. One of our tech customers on the West Coast, we alerted them about that attack even before they were aware of it. They immediately sort of disseminated that information in the company to logistics, supply chain, procurement, security net leaders, basically to be aware of it. And there's not only just one impact of such a cyber attack on your IT wise, right? There might also be down the line impacts on, that cyber CrowdStrike attack actually hit a lot of airports globally, right? So basically that company had 200 employees traveling at the time, and they were all delayed, right? So you really need to mitigate also the downstream effects, not only on your supply chain, not only on your operations, but also where else a cyber attack can really hit you. Because if executives are traveling, if engineers are traveling, and they can't get to where they are supposed to be to maintain machinery, at production plants that he really has an impact that probably no one is really thinking about immediately when they find out about this attack. So this is really what companies are trying to accomplish with us, as being alerted as soon as it's possible and monitoring any cyber threat that is going on in their supply chain.
One little funny comment I was just thinking of is just like these supply chains and these companies are dealing with concerns facing their supply chains. Like it's truly coming from like earth, wind, fire, like your phone, your email. Like there's so many different areas of worry. Like you need almost like that second support to assist you in these times, because there's a lot at stake and there's a lot of risk. And an additional one, which I think is pretty interesting, that is separate from tariffs and regulations, but it's quite similar, is the increased demand and focus on critical earth minerals and metals. And just this past December, we saw that regulation within China canceling the exportation of many critical earth metals and minerals. And those are really interesting to me because like that's in one day. That's in 24 hours. A new regulation hits, and then the next day, like they're stopping exportation of like these very, very high in demand resources. And so, what does this increased demand for these materials? What does that mean for the supply chain? And like how do companies that depend on these materials, how do they prepare for the scarcity of these rare earth metals and minerals? What are your thoughts on this? And I believe this was the fourth biggest risk in 2025.
Yeah, it's definitely, as you said, rightly so, right? In December 2024, there was definitely a big, had ripple effects through the industry and was a wake-up call in a way. But it's also been a trend that sort of we've been tracking for a while. This actually started with the semiconductor equipment restriction that the US imposed, right? Because, I mean, if you want to go back to maybe first Trump White House, first Trump administration, obviously global trade war, there was a lot of tariffs involved, and there was tit for tat, as you rightly said. But what we've seen change basically in the last 3 years was, first of all, the US was targeting, in a very specific way, the semiconductor equipment exports of its entire industry, basically to China, to sort of halt the advance of those really high-powered advanced chips that China could sort of produce with those machinery from elsewhere. And basically, China was trying to find a way to answer to those restrictions which have been in place since October 2022. And they started to, look at obviously where China has a near monopoly in terms of goods and especially high-value goods, and but without hurting the economy or their own economy too much, right? And so they started by looking at some critical raw materials, because most of them actually China produces or mines 90% of those and processes these. And they started to impose first export controls, make it harder basically for companies. They always had to get a permit to export them, the Chinese companies, and then the buyers. So it was, basically the state had much more control over who could buy and who couldn't. And they started this with gallium, then they moved into germanium, then they moved into graphite, which are all, very probably unheard of materials that are used in everything from semiconductors to airplanes to the military devices. And then basically they started doing this in the last 18 months. And then in December last year, it was basically a big escalation. But basically it was because they've tried it before and they've seen how much disruption it could cause. And obviously they're using the ones where they have a near monopoly, and which really also hurt. And there is really no short-term solution to it, right? They're not easily replaceable. Building up those mines elsewhere costs a lot of money, takes a lot of time. There's a lot of environmental concerns, permits that you need. And so they're in a very dominant position and can really use this also as a bargaining chip in future negotiations, which are, again, bring us back to the tariffs and what's happening right now, and the potential, 10% or 60%, which have been, talked about at one point. But it could be another bargaining chip in those negotiations. And I think we should see it in that sort of overall scheme.
I mean, you bring up so many good points right here. And I think in addition to that, like a few years ago with the Inflation Reduction Act, it was kind of like a different way of kind of like canceling out the exportation. But like the President Biden, like the U.S. administration had incentivized the domestic production of steel and these different materials to kind of like create a vertical supply chain within the United States. But adversely, that cancels out the the trading contracts and other materials coming into the United States, instead of like the cancellation of exportation, it's like let's support and invest within the United States to build out these supply chains within our country. It is so astounding how ahead the Chinese are within the green energy transition. They are light years ahead in terms of production and exportation of EV vehicles and the purchasing of EV vehicles. And I do have a fear that the United States, we are obviously an economic and competitive hub, but in this energy transition, I worry that our back and forth of our investments within the energy transition will deter us from being a top competitor in 5 years, because the Chinese are so ahead of us, and there's obviously an international turn of events where we're leaning into more decarbonization and low carbon technologies, which I hope the U.S. doesn't fall too behind. Anyways, that was really interesting to me, and I really appreciate this report. And as we close, I just wanted to open up the floor. Ryan, is there anything that you want to add? And I'm just looking for any.
Just a comment on your last comment. I can't say too much, but we actually have several really key customers that are, we'll just say the battery supply chain is very important to them for various reasons. And I can tell you there's a lot of movement right now to make sure that the U.S. and the U.S.'s allies have access to the commodities and the know-how so that we could continue to build high quality batteries and be competitive. There's a lot unknown out there, but there is certainly movement. I mean, if you're in that business, you're not standing still, that's for sure.
Right, exactly. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time here. I wanted to see, where can listeners and readers access this report if they're interested in learning more?
Yeah, absolutely. You can go through our website. I think it's first front page. You should be able to download it. Just need to write a few details, and then you'll be able to download it in no time. So our website, everstream.ai, is the best place to get access to that.
I'll just add hats off to our graphics team, because if you're thinking this is going to be a boring 30-page white paper, it's not. It's very succinct. It's very easy to read and absorb. Lots of graphics. So Gavin, I thought it was pretty easy to absorb as far as these things go. So I encourage everyone to take a look.
Yeah, I agree. And I don't feel like it's like fear mongering or anything. It's actually tangible information that is really important. And even for somebody on the outside, it's still, as you can hear from this conversation, supply chain touches almost every part of the global economy. So very interesting. And I really want to say thank you guys so much. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Mirko, for coming on today. And I hope to see you next year so we can talk about the 2026 report. And Ryan and I are actually going to be meeting in Orlando in just a few weeks and speaking at the ARC forum. So I'm really looking forward to continuing on this conversation together on the floor.
Likewise, yeah. And I'm looking forward to getting out of this Northeast weather, Gavin. I don't know about you, but